Greetings and blessings, everyone. This is Rick Caldwell with Caldwell Apologetics. Today we're going to talk about critical theory and the Christian worldview. Are they compatible? Before we get started, be sure you click the subscribe button and click the little notification bell to the right to ensure that you get the latest update notifications when new videos are released. And this will be part one of this series. In this part one, what we want to explore is defining what critical theory is. That's all we're going to accomplish in part one. In part two, we'll cover the pros and cons of critical theory and see how critical theory sizes up with a Christian worldview. So, what is a worldview? A worldview is a network of presuppositions which are not verified by the procedures of natural science regarding reality, metaphysics, knowing, epistemology, and conduct, ethics, in terms of which every element of human experience is related and interpreted. This definition is from Pushing the Antithesis by Greg Bahnsen. And speaking on presuppositions, what is a presupposition? Presupposition is an elementary or foundational assumption in one's reasoning or in the process by which opinions are formed. It is not just an assumption in an argument, but a personal commitment that is held at the most basic level of one's network of beliefs. Also, from Pushing the Antithesis by Greg Bahnsen. And as Christians, why should we care? If we are determined to reach people in the culture with the gospel, we need to understand the ideas they are embracing. Also, these ideas, the ideas of critical theory, have already infiltrated conservative evangelical churches. So those are two reasons why we need to care. And these are some examples of some things throughout social media that crop up from time to time. These are just examples. Christians should care about social justice because the gospel is about caring for the poor. It doesn't really matter whether Jesus is God anyway. The church needs to stop oppressing women. Smash the patriarchy. Wicca for all. Did you learn that from a white evangelical? Just a few examples of some things on the internet, on social media, that represent a discussion, even within the church, of things relevant to critical theory. We're going to define critical theory here in a moment. What is critical theory? Critical theory is a broad area of knowledge that originated with the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1930s and has expanded and evolved dramatically since then. We got to go back in time. Karl Marx is considered to be the consummate critical theorist, not because of his ideas about economics, but because ideas around how power circulates in society and produces and reproduces areas of inequality and exploitation. Antonio Gramsci is the second figure whose work is essential for understanding contemporary critical theory. We'll spend some time later talking about the contemporary forms of critical theory. But Gramsci was puzzled by Marx's failed prediction of a communist revolution, stating, why did workers in factories who knew firsthand the brutality of industrial capitalism never organize, thereby giving implicit support to the function of the factory and indeed the entire economic system? So Karl Marx had predicted that there would be a revolution of the working class versus the ruling class, and that never took place. And so Antonio Gramsci was asking the question and was puzzled as to why this didn't take place. To explain this phenomenon, Gramsci formulated his theory of hegemony, this social, cultural, or economic influence exerted by a dominant group over other groups. And we're going to talk about hegemony more because that was the conclusion that Gramsci came to as the reason why there wasn't a revolution of the working class as Karl Marx had predicted. more about how we define critical theory. Critical theory, in all its forms, holds that people are oppressed not particularly or primarily by coercion, but by various ideologies like individualism, meritocracy, or capitalism. When we consider the contemporary, what we see today in modern society, the contemporary critical theory, and this term, by the way, contemporary critical theory, is something two gentlemen, Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer, as they've been doing research, two brothers in Christ who have been doing research on this issue, they have coined the term contemporary critical theory in order to for us to better understand the impact in the world today in society. Well, contemporary critical theory views reality through the lens of power. That's very important. Through the lens of power, dividing people into oppressed groups and oppressor groups along various axes like race, class, gender, sexuality, orientation, physical ability, and age. So let just give you an illustration here of how all these axes of race, sexuality, gender, disability or ability, and nationality all fit together in this whole scheme of contemporary critical theory. And since the 1930s, since the time of Gramsci, there have been various disciplines of critical theory. We have cultural studies, we have post-colonialism, we have critical pedagogy, we have postmodernism, we have feminism, black feminism, queer theory, and also critical race theory. One of the challenges with critical theory is that it resists essentialism. When I was listening to a presentation by Neil Shenvi, when he was talking about some of the challenges of critical theory, he mentioned essentialism, meaning it's difficult to define. Often it is a challenge to understand how a critical theory is critical. But when we think of critical theory, there are a couple of words that are out on social media, or you may have seen in books if you've taken time to read about critical theory, which I believe every believer should take some time to at least get a grasp on what critical theory is and is not. There are certain words that have been propagating and promulgating around social media and in books, and these are a few of the words. If you haven't been under a rock, you've probably heard a few of these words, either on interviews and in books, and definitely on social media. Words like intersectionality, words like white privilege, white fragility, colorblind racism, internalized oppression, lived experience, heteronormativity, gender performativity, epistemic injustice, cis heteropatriarchy, compulsory heterosexuality, and whiteness. These are just a few of the words that are really borrowing from the idea or support the idea of critical theory that have made their inroads across social media and books and interviews. And these are a couple of the players. We need to know we need to put faces behind contemporary critical theory. And it's really important we understand who some of the players are. And these people that are here are across a wide spectrum of academic disciplines, from lawyers to philosophers to psychologists, that all have played a role in helping to define various aspects, various disciplines under critical theory. For example, Kimberly Crenshaw and Peggy McIntosh and Robin DiAngelo and Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Patricia Hill Collins and Murianne Adams and Richard Delgado and Beverly Tatum. Just a few of the names. There's others involved, but these are some of the top names around ideas of critical theory, writing about issues of oppression and the oppressed groups. So let us continue. Like I mentioned before, also we need to give a shout out. I need to give a shout out to Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. These two gentlemen And I know there probably are others, but these two gentlemen, especially on social media, have been prominent in really putting a light on the issue of critical theory, helping to define it, helping the church to get a deeper and better understanding of what it is and what it is not. So I encourage everyone to follow them on Twitter. Both of them have Twitter handles there. Please do follow them because this is an area. I know that Neil also has an apologetics website. I believe it's called shenviapologetics.com. But you can go there to get additional information. He has a ton of articles about critical theory that's very helpful for the church. So there are a couple of premises that Neil and Pat have laid out that deal with contemporary critical theory that we need to explore. And like I said today, all I want to do is define critical theory. We'll pick up the pros and cons and then the implications for the church in the next part 2 of this presentation. So what is contemporary critical theory and what are the premises behind it? There are 4 premises that we want to look at. Premise 1, social binary. Premise 2, oppression through ideology. Premise 3, lived experience. Premise 4, social justice. So let's look at social binary. Society is divided into oppressor and oppressed groups: class, gender, sexuality, race, ability, etc. And this diagram here, taken from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, 2nd edition, highlights the distinction between privileged social groups and the target or oppressed groups. So you see that there are different areas that are presented, or different categories that are presented. Categories like race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, religion, and age. And notice there that the privileged groups are if you're white, if you're biologically male, if you're heterosexual. Those are considered within the purview, within the scope of privileged groups. And then if you go to the right and look at the target social groups, or what they would consider the oppressed groups, what do you have? You have Asians, blacks, Latinos, Native people, you have biological women, you have those groups there presented. If you even look down at religion, you see Jews and Muslims and Hindus are considered part of the oppressed group because the whole idea that's being formulated behind critical theory is that if you're white, if you're male, if you're Protestant, that is within the purview or the scope of the privileged or the oppressor group. Okay? Hope that was helpful. So intersectionality complicates the social binary but does not erase or reverse it. Someone can be a part of the oppressor group and the oppressed group at the same time. So these photos that I have here illustrate the point. There is a women's rally, and on the left photo you see the words, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump," right? And so on the right hand side you see it's someone holding a sign that says, "Feminism without intersectionality is white supremacy." So you have women both at the same rally, but clearly 2 different agendas being articulated or being presented here at the rally, right? So this shows you how someone can be part of an oppressed group or part of one of these groups and also be part of the oppressor group at the same time. That's really important that we understand. And that creates a level of complexity, but at the very same time, we need to understand, even with that complexity there, because of intersectionality, because of these overlapping group distinctives, okay, it doesn't eliminate the fact that those distinctives are there, and we need to look at those. What is premise 2? Premise 2 is oppression via hegemonic power. And hegemony refers to the control of the ideology of society. Remember, that's what Antonio Gramsci was reasoned as a reason why the working class did not revolt against the dominant class in society, and there wasn't the communist revolution. Hegemony refers to the control of the ideology of society. The dominant group maintains power. How? By imposing their ideology on everyone. So this quote is from Sensoy and D'Angelo in the book, Is Everyone Really Equal? So that's where one instance of where hegemony is defined. Also a quote from Iris Young in Readings for Diversity and Social Justice. In its new usage, oppression designates the disadvantage and injustice some people suffer not because of tyrannical power coerces them, but because of the everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society. So now what we have is a redefinition of what oppression is. Oppression is not someone with a gun or someone with an army coming against you. Oppression is an oppression of ideas. Ideas that, or they control those ideas against those who are perceived to be of the oppressed group. And so that's really important that we understand how the definition of oppression has taken a shift. Also, let's kind of look at how the population and different groups are distributed in the countries. We see one of the things that to take note is that old white men make up 15%, yet they're not considered a minority. Why are white men in America considered a minority, for example? Why is that the case? It's because it goes back to the idea of hegemonic power. Who is perceived to be the one that's actually exercising their influence over others? The old white men might be a minority, but are not treated as such because they're perceived. White men are perceived, old white men, old white Protestant men, and all the other things, old white Protestant men, and you can put other things in, are perceived to be the ones who actually are controlling the narrative, controlling the message, controlling the ideologies that others have to follow, who are setting the norms and traditions that others are following. Okay? Premise number 3. Lived experience gives oppressed groups privileged access to truth. According to the philosopher Charles Mills, hegemonic dominant groups characteristically have experiences that foster illusory perceptions about society's functioning, whereas subordinate groups characteristically have experiences that at least potentially give rise to more adequate conceptualizations. So in a nutshell, the whole idea is that the hegemonic dominant group is all essentially blind to the realities that the subordinate group can clearly see. And therefore, since the dominant group is not a part of that subordinate group, there are certain truths or certain realities that they are oblivious to. And so that gives the oppressed group better access or deeper insight into what is really going on. This is from Jose Medina's book, Epistemology of Resistance. Here's a quote from Charles R. Lawrence III in the book, The Word and the River, Pedagogy as Scholarship as Struggle. We must learn to privilege our own perspectives and those of other outsiders. He goes on to say, we must trust our own senses, feelings, and experiences, and to give them authority even or especially in the face of dominant accounts of social reality that claim universality. So this speaks to the very point that this lived experience of this subordinate group or this oppressed group should be the very foundation by which they evaluate truth claims. So that's really important as we move forward. This premise 3 about the value of a lived experience. Another thing to consider from Margaret L. Anderson and Patricia Hill Collins in the book Race, Class, and Gender The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking. See that? Western and masculine way of thinking. One that we will challenge throughout this book. That's from Margaret L. Anderson and Patricia Hill Collins in the book Race, Class, and Gender. So this is a great illustration looking at some of those quotes from those various authors. This is a great way to break it down. This image here, this photo here, where you have at the top left, you have what's called the privileged group, those who have hegemony, those who are controlling the narrative, those who are controlling the ideologies, and they are blind essentially to the realities that are really going on because they're controlling the narrative and are oblivious to the realities of the oppressed group. And then you have those who are maybe a part of the oppressed group, but because they echo the narrative of those who are in hegemonic power, they're perceived to have what is called internalized oppression. And then to the right, you see when someone is able to get what's called liberatory consciousness, or another vernacular word out there, phrase is get woke. They're able to see reality as it is through the lived experiences of those who have been oppressed.
You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today.
Premise number 4, social justice demands the liberation of oppressed groups. Prior to celebrating diversity, we must first eliminate intolerance, no matter what form it takes or who does it. We must all take action to stop intolerance when it happens. Working towards a celebration of diversity implies working for social justice. And they define social justice, the elimination of all forms of social oppression. Another quote taken from the same book by Mary McClintock is, social justice takes many forms. It can be injustice based on a person's, now listen to this is important, person's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, physical or mental disability, or economic status. This takes us back to the illustration I had before, where you had all these converging areas of concern or categories that were just mentioned in Mary McClintock's definition of social injustice. Okay. And so with that being said, the conclusion I want to bring to you, and as we conclude part 1 of this presentation, is critical theory is an important and influential ideology in today's culture. When people are talking about ideas around justice and injustice, especially what we see in social media, what is being echoed, what is being reverberated through social media, what's being seen through the media, and we see these ideas. And what we're going to talk about in part 2 are the pros and cons of critical theory and the dangers that it imposes on the church. So stay tuned for part 2. Hope you were blessed by this presentation. Stay tuned.